Hello and a very warm welcome indeed to Quadriga, coming to you from the heart of Berlin. And exactly 1 year after last September's national election, Angela Merkel's government has this week once again been threatening to fall apart at the seams. The latest bone of contention was this man. Hans-Georg Maaßen, the head of Germany's domestic intelligence agency, was ousted from office on Tuesday after a damaging quarrel within the coalition over his reaction to recent far-right attacks on immigrants in the eastern city of Chemnitz. So where does the squabbling leave Chancellor Merkel, and what kind of leadership can she deliver for Germany and for Europe? So our question here on Quadriga this week is Merkel's government mired in conflict? And to discuss that question, I'm joined in the studio by three astute observers and analysts of all things German. Beginning with Malte Lehming, an author and senior editor at the Berlin-based daily Der Tagesspiegel. Malte says that by firing Hans-Georg Maaßen, Angela Merkel has saved her coalition government, but the price is that she's lost the respect of many voters. Also with us is Andreas Kluth, editor-in-chief of Handelsblatt Global. Andreas argues that Germany's so-called Grand Coalition was never meant to be and is doomed to failure, just when it should be tackling huge tasks. And a very warm welcome too to Deutsche Welle's own Nina Haase, the head of DW's domestic politics unit. Nina believes that Angela Merkel's biggest problem is her own interior minister. One big step towards restoring voters' trust in politics, she says, would be to replace Horst Seehofer. Well, of course, we're going to be talking a lot about Horst Seehofer in the half an hour to come or so. But Malte Lehming, I'd like to begin by talking about Hans-Georg Maaßen, the head of Germany's domestic spy agency. You described him this week as an incompetent busybody and said he had to go. What did he get so badly wrong? Why did he have to go, and why is it so important?
I have a very strong opinion about him because the interview he gave after an incident in Chemnitz, in the eastern town of Chemnitz, where manslaughter had happened, right-wing mob, a mixture between the population and the right-wing, went to the street, and there was a video that showed that a dark-skinned man was chased by what seemed to be an angry crowd. And he went on and gave a boulevard newspaper an interview saying that he questions the authenticity of this video, put that out, and even came close to conspiracy theories about wrong informations and targeted misinformations and all these things. And that fueled the right-wing populist rhetoric so much that this interview was just a capital mistake. I would not put into doubt that much his capacity as being a head of the domestic intelligence service. But this interview alone, in this situation, this is the most sensitive topic in German politics. If the influx of refugees are fueling criminal rates and things like that, this is so very, very sensitive that it was a capital mistake, and he has to be punished for that.
Yeah, and Nina, he hasn't just been... He has been punished. He's been...
Has he?
Yeah, good. OK, yeah. I've got to be cautious here. Yeah, he's in the process... I'm being very cautious now. He's in the process of being removed from office, but he's being booted upstairs, effectively, as they say. He's going to another job, better paid, at Horst Seehofer's Interior Ministry. And that is now another...
Explain that to your children, right?
Yeah, exactly, over the breakfast table. Yeah. It's another threat to the coalition, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Horst Seehofer made it very, very clear that he was not going to let go of Maaßen, that he trusts him, that he wants him to work closely with him, and he made that very clear to Chancellor Angela Merkel. So in the end, the only option for her was to give both sides, those who demanded that he be removed from his post as top spy chief, and Horst Seehofer, the Interior Minister, who said, I am going to stick with this man. She needed to give both sides something, and we ended up with a foul compromise that is really hard to explain to voters, children, to people anywhere in the world. And Twitter was full of memes saying, like, you know, next time he doesn't buy a ticket on the train, he'll get a free ticket for the month. So, you know, Sigmar Gabriel, SPD officials said that, you know, he's on his way to becoming the United Nations Secretary General. I have no words for this. He was not punished.
Well, do you have words to explain Horst Seehofer? I know you interviewed him recently. He's in the twilight of his career, yeah?
Yeah.
He's really central to German politics at this point in time, maybe for not much longer, but at this point in time, absolutely central. Tell us about him. What were your impressions when you were face-to-face?
Well, I went to the party convention in Munich on Saturday and I asked him, Mr. Seehofer, is the coalition at threat? And he just said, it isn't. Believe me, we'll stick together. He was so convinced that he was going to get his way, as he always has been convinced that he is right. And I think that is essentially is Horst Seehofer's problem. For years, he did have this feeling for what the people want, and sometimes he risked really unpopular positions.
He was a populist before we started talking so obsessively about populists.
Exactly, but now he's completely lost sight of rational politics. He has completely gone astray, and he is provoking Angela Merkel wherever he can. And it's high time, I believe, that the Chancellor lets go of him. I think this won't happen before the Bavarian elections, of course, and they are in 4 weeks' time. There are important regional elections, also for Angela Merkel's Conservatives as a whole. But he is an extremely risky figure, and he is behind all the conflicts in this current government coalition that we've seen in recent months.
Andreas, you're nodding. I'm sure you want to chip in. Just one thing. Horst Seehofer is sometimes described by commentators as a grudge politician, and it is then suggested that he won't go down until he can take Angela Merkel with him.
Yes.
Do you buy into that?
It's possible. I mean, several things you already mentioned. He is a populist, always has been a populist. We call a populist party called the Alternative for Germany is the populist party, but the CSU has always had that tendency, and Horst Seehofer within it has been, compared to previous leaders like Franz Josef Strauss, who was also a statesman and knew that there are priorities. Horst Seehofer very much makes beer tent politics, is very all over the place, and can think small in a smart way, and is myopic. In other words, does not understand that because of this unique relationship between CDU and CSU, which exists nowhere else in the world, that he does not just make politics for the beer tent next October, but that he affects Brussels, the Eurozone, the European Union, the Western alliance to some extent, geopolitics involving China, that all of that he puts at risk because of this grudge.
That's a big agenda.
By the way, but there's two things eating him. I think this long grudge match with Angela Merkel, whom he calls "du," the formal "you." They're pretending to be buddies, which makes it even worse if you're watching this in German. And a bitter, long fight that he has with the Prime Minister of Bavaria in his own party. They're all just waiting for each other to drop. So I think he's very close to the end of his career. He knows it, and it's possible that what you just said can't be ruled out, that he just wants to take a few people down with him.
But I think that we should not focus too heavily on Horst Seehofer. He didn't start the fight. The fight was started then by the SPD, who said Maaßen has to leave. And Seehofer and many people in his party and the CDU, the other part of the Conservative Party, thought, yeah, he made a mistake, but he is a good man. So he has not to be fired. So by backing Maaßen, Seehofer was not alone. He was, I think most of the party was standing behind him. And I still don't know where Merkel stands in this case. If he just said, I wanted to keep my coalition together, or whether she clearly thinks he has to go. Maaßen. So that's an open question. Nobody knows exactly.
It's certainly an unholy mess for the time being, and some commentators are asking, or are saying, in years gone by, Angela Merkel wouldn't have let this happen. She's too skillful a politician. Should we now assume that she is too wounded, too weakened, that her hands are tied, that they're tied behind her back, in fact?
We're talking about a foul compromise, and I really agree with that. But what was the alternative? Either Maaßen stays in power, then the SPD must have left the coalition, we would have new elections. He's been fired without any scruple. Then the CSU and lots of the CDU would be very, very disappointed. And the right-wing populists of the AfD, we just talked about, had a new martyr story. Whoever dares to speak against the Chancellor, get out of it. So it seems that this foul compromise to fire him and promote him in the same way, and in the same sense, seems to be the only solution that was left. It was typical Merkel solution. I mean, it was just so typical of her because she always feels where the threats are for her government, and then she acts accordingly.
Can I just say something that I observed at the party conference in Munich on Saturday? I thought it was extremely interesting how the CSU officials stood on stage for the first time publicly attacking the AfD, who are their real competitors, like you said. But behind the scenes, everybody you talk to only focused on the SPD. And they all blame the current conflict on the SPD. And this just goes to show that this coalition is extremely weakened. It's full of mistrust. And the big problem is that Germany is in a position where it really just can't afford to have these people questioning each other all the time. I mean, let's just remember the last conflict is not so long ago. It was only in July. Again, it was a question where the SPD... It looked really weak. So this time around, I think the SPD couldn't afford to look weak. If they want to keep some of their voters, then they had to make a big stand this time round, because last time they looked like they had no say in this coalition at all. And this is a very bad sign for Germany because it's clearly paralysed.
Andreas, we had, first of all, there was a conflict in the coalition almost immediately after it was installed about whether Islam belongs to Germany. Then we had a huge fight in the coalition about whether refugees should be turned back on the southern border, Germany's southern border. Now we've been talking for 11, 12 days about Hans-Georg Maaßen and his views on far-right violence. Is there a common thread there?
Yes. The common thread is very simple. These three parties... never wanted to be together again after the election last autumn. Another coalition was tried and failed, and then the president and other people of this German elite put enormous pressure under the very German concept of stability to do it again, even though they didn't want to. And they don't trust each other, and they know, and I think a lot of people, and they, including them, know that this sort of... The Austrians did it for decades, these grand coalitions, which allowed people to get alienated from this kind of politicking backroom deals when the big issues are untalked about, and drifted to the wings. And now the populists in Austria are in the government. So they're just creating one little crisis after another because they don't trust each other. You have to remember that all these crises you mentioned are either rhetorical, but they're small crises. For instance, the one about turning back migrants. When you actually counted, as some people did, how many migrants would be affected, I think it was 5 a day.
Yeah.
These are semantics. These are cosmetic. This is when people want to argue and want to tell themselves that they're right. This is what they do. At the time when the real issues, because you have to remember that Paris, London because of Brexit, but Paris, where Macron has for over a year been waiting for Germany to back him up on big reforms of the Eurozone, for example. There's no answer because they're busy with this stuff. And that's the disaster. This stability, that is the reason why they're together, but this is not stable, it's unstable, and there are actually better alternatives, and there are things that Merkel, she should have fired Seehofer this summer, the first time around.
When he offered to resign.
When he offered to resign. And she should have let the CSU walk out, and she should have let the coalition tumble, and then we would be in a better place today.
OK, thanks for that. Malte, before we move on, we'll get some images. Yeah, there was decades ago a British Prime Minister who once told the British people, "You've never had it so good," and it was a phrase that stuck. It got repeated time and time again. And ironically, given some of the doom and gloom that we've just been talking about, the same could be said about today's Germany. They've never had it so good. Andreas is nodding. The question is, have they?
The economy's in good shape. Unemployment is low. Many Germans are doing better than ever. But the squabbling in the coalition government has put a lot of people off. They argue about domestic security and asylum policy and social security, and a lot of voters are tired of it. Many have vented their frustrations by taking to the streets. Crowds of angry citizens have demonstrated in Chemnitz and Köthen against the Chancellor's immigration policy and what they consider the dangers of Islam. Activists occupied part of Hambach Forest in western Germany to protest plans to expand a large coal mine nearby. They also claim that the government's environment policies are contradictory. Why are so many Germans so angry right now?
Nina, why are so many Germans so angry right now? I mean, there were very different kinds of protesters there. Let's focus on the far right, the threat that comes from the far right. Why are so many people Wutbürger, angry citizens?
I think there are just lots of people who are dissatisfied with the way politicians seem to be placing the focus in public on issues like power politics and those nitty-gritty details of who stays in which office, rather than focusing on the real problems. I mean, there are parts in this country where not everything is looking good. The figures may look good, but the bridges are crumbling. People don't get access to childcare. You know, there are lots of essential topics that just don't seem to get through anymore to the people in power, to the government in particular. And the SPD has been trying to sell their projects that they are working on, but it's clearly failing. So people in the streets are just saying, look, and what about me? Why do we talk about those 5 people on the border every day, all day long, when really, you know, I need to have access to a doctor in this rural part of Germany where I live? And I just don't.
I would give two short answers. One is a lack of leadership. The second is a lack of representation. Lack of leadership, I mean, Merkel is really, really good in solving problems. She's not so good in giving speeches, explaining herself. She is no Obama-like. She doesn't give tweets like Trump does. She's not as charismatic as Macron in France, and so on and so on. So she is a problem solver and not a leader.
She is. I just want to clarify that point. Not she was, she is a problem solver.
I would still say
she hasn't lost her mojo.
She is, yes. The second is lack of representation. When 1.2 million refugees were pouring in, and from the fall in 2015, basically all parties that were in government supported her policy. But 20–25% of the population just didn't feel represented by the public. So this changed in the last election when the AfD, the right-wing populist party, gained some seats, and I think 13% of the votes. So now they have a kind of representation, but still going to the streets, and more people are going to the streets in East Germany because that's what their history is. Going to the streets might change anything.
And we've had Wolfgang Schäuble, the head. He'd be very familiar to very many international viewers. He's now the Speaker of the German Parliament, the Bundestag. He's come out and said that he's concerned that more and more people in Germany are questioning whether democracy is the right model. Andreas?
I doubt that we're in that sort of Weimar 2.0 phase. In Eastern Germany, yes. If you add the left party, the ex-communist party, and the Alternative for Germany together, you get in some places to almost half, and that is deeply worrisome. But I don't think in West Germany we're anywhere near that. But you know, if you say what could make it better, or what's to blame for that trend if it exists, then I think it is these grand coalitions again and again, and this sort of centrist parties getting mushed together and stifling real debate on big things and just keeping themselves busy with little laws on some, you know, technicalities of rent rises in your area when big things are at stake. In a world of Trump and Putin and so forth. And that alienates people and drives them. They used to be non-voters, and now they go to the fringes. And if you wait a little bit longer, then you get something that you have in Austria now, or you get something where people, there was a poll I saw where people did yearn, the ratio, especially in the Alternative for Germany, but even in the general population is going up, of people who yearn for a strong leader. And the German word in the poll used was Führer.
And the public is, I would say, is fed up with these symbolic civil wars that they have in the government, because these, you can't see the real results. I mean, there is a government governing, On the very same day that the whole Maaßen scandal erupted, we have the 5.5 billion investment in preschool things. We had the Heiko Maas, the foreign secretary, is traveling abroad. We have the EU summit where the chancellor was attending. We have Olaf Scholz, the finance minister. So people are working. And the coalition contract still has some good. I mean, security of the pensions, getting rid of coal burning, and all these things that nobody talks about, because we have these symbolic civil wars that leads to nothing. So I think people are really fed up with that.
Business as usual in a positive sense there.
It could be business as usual, and there is business going on.
OK, we've been talking a lot about German politics, about domestic politics, but what about the rest of the world, and Europe especially? There's a real sense that this is a real time of crisis gathering, that a time of tectonic change, and while all this is going on, Germany is locked in navel-gazing.
America no longer seems willing to play a leading role in international relations. President Trump wants to press ahead with making various individual deals and has pulled the U.S. out of several multilateral agreements. He's launched trade wars against China and Canada. The European Union is threatened by Brexit and the rise of right-wing populist parties. Russia continues to challenge the West in Syria, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. And China is actively pursuing its foreign policy goals. But the German government seems focused only on itself. Does Germany still have a role to play in international politics?
Does Germany still have a role to play in international politics? Of course, yes. But Frank-Walter Steinmeier, Germany's president, has been quoted in the last couple of days as saying he's astonished how closely people around Europe have been following domestic developments in Germany and how concerned they are. What do you think they see when they look at Germany at this point in time, Andreas?
They see what I see, and what I'm concerned is that there are these big issues that are actually not being debated, when in fact Germans think that, okay, they're doing a list of little things, that they're keeping themselves busy. They're realizing that because of this dysfunctional coalition, and which weakens the chancellor, that there is no leadership on Germany, which happens to be the largest country in the European Union, which means that effectively Eurozone reforms, genuine migration reforms, are stalled, and some debates that could determine the future of Europe and Germany, such as America withdrawing from the continent, forcing the Europeans and the Germans to figure out a solution for their own defense, are not being had.
The Süddeutsche Zeitung, an influential German paper this week, came out, Malte, and said nothing like a courageous foreign policy agenda in sight. Is that an accurate assessment, or is there business as usual going on as well in the foreign policy field?
No, I mean, European policy is very, very difficult right now. It's overloaded by the refugee crisis, and we've still unsolved debt crisis, reform of the Brussels system, and so on. So it's very, very complicated. So I doubt that we will see in the near future any German government who just comes out and finds a solution for all the European problems we are facing. It is very, very complicated. So I think it could be more, but it could not be the grand, I mean, the grand posture that you have, the European policy. I think, for example, refugees, a lot happened. A lot has happened. The influx from the Balkan route through Turkey, and so it's not stopped, but it's really going down. Refugees from Africa, I think the number is in the first half of this year 40,000. This is much less than the years before. So Merkel's trips to African countries, pulling out investment plans and so on, you don't see the results immediately. But it seems to be kind of coherent policy to stop this crisis to evolve again.
Mm-hmm. Nina, a final say. Everybody outside Germany always wants to know, is Angela Merkel still in the driving seat, and does she have a, well, I'm not going to say a roadmap, but a route map?
She's extremely weakened and, like I say, she's being taken hostage by the Bavarians to a certain extent. So those next couple of weeks are going to not leave her much wriggling room because, of course, she can't risk the Conservatives in Bavaria to lose even more. And if we look at next year, what's going to happen there? I mean, she's not going to come out stronger if the European elections provide the results that we are predicting at the moment, where, you know, there'll be strong anti-EU forces in the EU government. Angela Merkel has always said that she believes Germany has its place in Europe and that her foreign policy, or, you know, her government's foreign policy will always be influenced by how Europe behaves. And if you've got anti-EU forces in Europe as well as in Germany, then it's going to get even tougher for her.
Andreas, a final word. The question that we had today on Quadriga, Merkel's government mired in conflict. Is it mired in conflict? Mired?
It's mired, it's sinking deeper in, it won't come out until there's a collapse and a minority government or a new election.
Interesting thoughts. Thank you all three for being here on Quadriga today. I hope we've given you plenty of food for thought. Come back next week. Tschüss. Auf Wiedersehen.